Stage 2 is here. Week 1 is finished. And I've got some thoughts. Hopefully this will be a reoccurring segment on the YouTube channel. But I want to do a weekend review, some of my favorite little key points. Nothing too terribly long, but just kind of looking at what happened during the week. Doing a little bit of a review. Going through some of the games and talking about how some of the teams are looking thus far. And week 1 of stage 2 is proven to be pretty crazy. I think we all assumed not the worst, but things were going to be moved and shaken up quite a bit. And they definitely have. And I'm going to pull up the maps on my second monitor here just so that I have something to reference to when I do talk about some of these compositional changes that we are seeing. So not only is Baptiste in, but we have a slew of changes. Armor's been reworked. Beam weapons have been changed around. Junkrat's been kind of thrust into the meta on some maps. DPS comps have been pushed into, you know, the forefront on certain maps. And Goats is still very good on most maps, right? When we look at the map pool, we have Lijiang Tower, which again breaks down into gardens, which I'd have to go back and see during week 1, but for the most part has always been historically a mixed kind of bag where you do see teams run Pharah-based compositions and you do see teams run DPS-based compositions, or Pharah would be the DPS compositions, and you see teams run Goats compositions or tank-style compositions, and they kind of rotate where they approach the point. You know, from tank compositions usually taking the white side, and the other DPS comps taking the bridge side. So tanks on the white room, DPS along the bridges. Then we have Control Center, which has always been, you know, very tank favored historically, just a very tight, choky map. A lot of strong choke points. You know, the first entrance that you get into the building with is very, very corridory. So it lends itself to playing tank compositions there. I don't think that'll change over time. We have seen Pharah be used there quite often, but for the most part, very Goat centric. Gardens, Control Center, and the Night Market, which is, again, a little bit of a mixed bag. We see mostly tank comps there, and I think that will be the meta going forward. But if you have a team like British Hurricane, for an example, and over in European contenders, they have Hammond compositions that do very well with some DPS picks. So again, somebody like the Chengdu Hunters, you know, Guangzhou, as much as, you know, we'll get into them later, could maybe innovate there a little bit. So Lijiang is a little bit of a mixed bag. Oasis and Busan, however, I won't go into each of their submaps because most of the submaps for both Oasis and Busan have been getting different looks. For the most part, Oasis has been DPS on most maps. Busan, again, DPS on most maps. So we have a little bit of parity there for those of you who don't like Goats. You know, week 1, stage 2. This is where you're going to want to do some VOD review. This is where you're actually going to get some enjoyment, because again, and I can't blame you if you're not a big fan of Goats. Can't blame you there. It is it is a acquired taste. You know, it's not something that you just see on a daily basis. It's not something you see in your you know, competitive matches. It is kind of like slower and a little bit more methodical. And if you're not paying attention to the little nuances in each and every map, and if you don't like fully understand it, I can understand why it's not necessarily your favorite, right? Paris has been kind of weird. I think teams are still figuring out exactly what they want to run there. We've seen a lot of Bash and Orisa, and teams trying to do whatever they can to fight into that. That's been fairly interesting. Temple of Anubis, another one. We are seeing teams still running Goats. We're seeing teams run new anti-Goats compositions into them, whether that is a Mercy Pocketed Junkrat, whether it's Widow Junkrat, Orisa. Temple's been kind of changed on its head. The same thing with Hanamura. I plan on doing a review of the Spark Titans game. That was kind of weird, especially on Hanamura, so I definitely will get into that. But Hanamura's been kind of turned on its head, I feel like. Blizzard World still feels very goats based. Eichenwald, very much goats based. King's Row, goats based. Very tanky maps, always historically good on tanks. Rialto, I think, could be mostly tanks. I think you'll see some teams run some different looks, but for the most part, I think you see a lot of tanks there. Gibraltar, I still think there is room to play sniper compositions and maybe hold aggressively with DPS-based comps the same way that Chengdu did against Washington. We could see that more and more, but for the most part, I'm going to say that's probably a tank-based map, and then Junkertown, very, very Widow, very Hangzhou-centric, Ash even being solid there. Doesn't have the same long-range movement abilities, but still, for the most part, still fits that map very well. So, again, if Goats wasn't your thing, it's not completely gone, but it's much better than it was last stage. You're actually getting some different compositions. If you know, you're getting a little bit of Genji here and there. Like, there is more variety in terms of what compositions are played, and I think that's a good thing overall, and I think most people would agree with that. In terms of a little bit deeper metagame thoughts, Sombra still seems very good. We saw in stage 1 her entrance into the metagame of this Goats rigidity, and a lot of people looked at it as, oh, well, I wouldn't say a lot of people. I think mostly, I should say a lot of people. I won't name names, or I won't name regions, but most people looked at her as a cheesy pick. Oh, if you're a good Goats team, you'll beat Sombra comps, and we saw that not necessarily work out, or at least the theory not fully tested, because some of these teams are not particularly amazing at one or two different styles of Goats. They kind of have their thing, and again, we've talked about in the past how Overwatch League and Contenders Goats is very different. But Sombra seems to carved out a nice niche for her in this metagame, whether it's the Bastion, Orisa, even the Goats. She's very, very good. Expect to see her played quite often. I still think everybody's figuring out what they want to do. We have seen this echoed, especially with Guangzhou, which we'll get into, and many other teams that have played in the playoffs. Guangzhou hasn't played in the playoffs, but again, I don't want to talk about them too much. Many of the teams that are struggling right now either have made massive changes to their roster or changed up their calling structure or played in the playoffs last stage, so they had less time to prepare for this stage. So you're seeing them kind of catch up, and after this week I expect them to do a little bit better. But there again, I think everybody's still figuring out exactly what they want to do on each map and trying to scout out the competition and see what everybody else is doing to kind of have a test, just to see where they fit in the pecking order of things in terms of strategy. So it's still a bit chaotic. Again, I still think Goats is pretty premier. If you can't run Goats, it's going to be a little rough for you. You're going to be forcing some very strange compositions. And that's not to say that Chengdu and their Symmetra strategies spell the end of their Goats run. They still have a serviceable Goats. I wouldn't say it's amazing. I wouldn't say it's good. I think it's very serviceable that they can rely on if their Symmetra leapfrog strategies or their pocket maze don't necessarily work out as well as intended. That said, another hero that I kind of referenced in the beginning of the video, Junkrat has kind of come back into vogue, especially on Temple of Anubis. We've seen, I think, in the Shanghai Gladiators game and Atlanta themselves, run that hero quite a bit on A and B with a Mercy Pocket. And that's interesting because not only did he get a damage buff with the Mercy Pocket, and again, I haven't necessarily looked at the damage numbers, there could be break-offs that are hit, or break points, that were hit that are a little bit... So the way that Blizzard decided to balance Junkrat this patch is they gave him 10 more impact damage with direct hits with his primary fire, but increased his ult, the amount of ult charge needed to channel Riptire by 10%. So you're kind of mitigating, okay, you've got a little bit more damage, but that damage won't necessarily correlate into more ultimates. We're trying to keep that. They seem to be trying to keeping that in line with one another, so it's not, more damage, more ults, Junkrat becomes crazy. Mercy kind of makes up for that discrepancy and breaks him again and giving him the more of the damage. Again, Anubis has a ton of high ground, low ground, just I wouldn't say disparity, but abilities to be able to move back and forth are very, very strong. Again, especially on a Anubis beat defense, you have multiple choke points that you can hold from. It actually kind of frees up your team from just holding on the point. You can actually hold from the choke, which we've seen, and to a varying degree of success. I think it's going to take some time for attackers to learn. It's not just an easy path up the middle. I think you actually have to worry about your pathing now, because Junkrat's going to be shelling you from above, and you don't really need your Rhine, especially if you're running goats, to be taking either all that damage or all that shield pressure, and it slows you down immensely. So teams are going to have to figure out exactly what they want to do on Anubis, because Junkrat has been seen quite a bit. And that's, for the most part, a lot of the metagame changes. And I wanted to talk about a couple teams that I've thought were fairly interesting this week. But before we do that, let's go over and take a look at the week 1 results. So New York over Philly shouldn't surprise anybody. Boston beating Atlanta was a decent shout. I thought Atlanta, I talked about it in my power rankings video, I thought Atlanta could perform better than what I had them ranked at. Doesn't seem to be the case. Hats off to Boston. Multiple reverse sweeps in a row. That's pretty crazy, and I think that's probably reliant on Fusions there. I think he is getting a lot of credit, and I think that's very deserved. He's very much like having a coach within your team, very vocal, not only gives you that pep kind of morale boost, but has strategies planned out and will, echo them from the coaching staff repeatedly throughout the game, which is very, very important, because people tend to shut down. They don't tend to communicate. And lo and behold, he's a good player, right? He's skilled. He has the mentality. He has the vocal leadership. He has an air of leadership about him as well, outside of just vocal commanding presence in communication in their structure, but just a guy that carries himself well and can kind of lead the troops if need be. Gladiators over Shanghai shouldn't surprise anybody. Paris over Guangzhou surprised a lot of people, I think. I think Guangzhou could have came into this stage and done very well. It doesn't seem like they're on the same page now. It looks like their approach to this new meta game has just been lost. Whatever practice they went into during the last 2 weeks, it's been rough, and they do not look good. I think I had them at like 7th or 8th or 6 through 8, I think, on my power rankings. I can't recall currently, but they are nowhere near that. They're not making stage playoffs. Even like I had them at stage playoffs, but that was rough as it was, just based on their schedule. They played Shock this week. They played Paris. They played Shock this week. They play Shock again, and then they play Gladiators. That's a rough stage off the bat. I had them beating Paris. They didn't actually beat Paris. They got crushed by Paris. Paris looks good. Paris looks very good, but we'll get into them. London 2-1 over Florida. Not shocking. I think it was actually pretty surprising that Florida was able to take a couple maps and make that competitive, but maybe that's not necessarily up to them. Maybe that was London just kind of like sleeping on them and being lackadaisical. That's a team that is very Philly-esque. You don't really know what you're going to get until, game day and they actually start playing. Very inconsistent. Toronto 3-1 over Washington. No surprises there. Shock beating Valiant. No surprises there. Gladiators over Seoul. I think this was the game that Fleta was not in. That's very worrisome for me, because I am very much a Fleta stan. Very much a Fleta, fanboy at heart. I followed his career for a long time. Seeing him not play raises some eyebrows. Are they rotating him out? Where is he? Is he sick? What's going on there? It's very bizarre. But there again, I don't know. Was that the breaking point? Was that the factor that could have pushed them over their edge? I don't think so. I think Gladiators probably was always going to take that. And if Fleta was in, maybe it was different, but I don't think so. So Gladiators over Seoul. Solid shout there. Philadelphia over Florida. I didn't watch that game live, but I heard that Florida was taking it to Philly quite a bit. So maybe this rebuild for Florida has been successful. Boston reverse sweeping Toronto, which is, again, pretty crazy. The fortitude that Boston is bringing to this team, day and match in, match out, is pretty crazy, and it's impressive to say the least. New York 3-0 over Shanghai, nothing shocking there. Chengdu 4 over Paris. That was actually kind of surprising after their match against Guangzhou. I assumed Paris was actually going to do a lot better than they did. I assumed that Chengdu was going to have a much harder time, and they seemed to just roll over Paris quite a bit. Shock over Guangzhou, no shocks there. I had Atlanta beating London just because London seemed to be pretty shaky, especially in their match against Florida. It seemed to be quite all over the place, and I figured Atlanta, given a couple extra days to prepare, they would have approached this a little bit better. Didn't seem like it was the case. They actually looked a little bit worse in my eyes. Lost 0-4. Spark loses 0-4 to Vancouver. No shocks there. And Chengdu takes a surprisingly close game against Washington with some extra strategy nonsense. And that kind of leads into what I think about Chengdu. So I've got a couple teams I want to talk about to close out the video and my takes on them. And Chengdu is my first one because that's my team. I've said that they're going to make the stage playoffs. They might actually go 7-0 this stage just because of how weak their schedule is and how prominent or how good I think they are in this meta, because it is so varied. It's going to be hard for teams to prepare for the meta in general and have the pieces to work on every map that they need to, and also prepare for Chengdu. Like that's just an extra step that teams need to do. So not only do they have the easier schedule, I do have some worries after that Washington game. They seem almost too eager to do some of these crazy, Symmetra leapfrog strategies on King's Row. I think that's going to get figured out pretty quickly, and it seems like Washington has a good look of kind of dealing with that. I want to dive into it a little bit more, but I think I have a good idea of what Washington used to approach Chengdu with that. But yeah, I don't want them to be super stubborn. They can play this very skirmishy style that Hangzhou has been showing, where they rely on that triple DPS comp quite a bit, have the Hammond player there. I think that's in their arsenal. They can definitely use that, and they're going to flourish in this metagame. I just don't want them to stick to things that are just so crazy and outlandish that I think it's causing more harm than good, I would say. In that same mention, I talk about Hangzhou. I don't know what this team needs to do. They're still super disjointed. On their control map against Vancouver, you see Gusha run in with Wrecking Ball and create a dive opportunity. Nobody's there to follow up. Is there communication breakdown still? I don't know. It looks messy. I feel like I really enjoy their coaching staff. Just historically, I believe it's Coach Mask from X6. Has a lot of innovative ways of positioning and has some very interesting compositional choices. But it doesn't seem to always work out as intended. Either it's too far gone or too far past what the players can play and remember, and it's just too intricate to actually apply, or it's just bad. One of the two. I think it's a little bit of the both. If anything, I think it's bad because it is too intricate and the players need to be able to read all these different situations, and maybe they can in scrims, but they can't practice because the pressure's on. I don't know. This team is an absolute mess. I still think they're plagued by comps being poor. You can very easily see that people are all over the place, but I think that plays into what they're running, if that makes sense. They're not running goats anymore. They see that they can run DPS. That's what they're running. Apparently that was what they were running before in stage 1, before, they went downhill and decided to be a goats team. I have no idea. They might be able to do okay this stage. I believe they have a relatively hard schedule if I'm glancing at it. I think their next matches are Boston, Guangzhou, which could be interesting. Shock's a loss. Chengdu, probably a loss. Paris, that's rough. And Seoul, that's another rough one. So like a semi-difficult stage. It's not the worst stage possible, but not the best for Hangzhou, I'm sorry. Overall, messy team. Could be interesting to follow if you're not a GOATS fan. If you're not a fan of all these tank-heavy compositions, Hangzhou, I think, is going to be what Guangzhou could have been. I think you're going to see a lot of DPS comps out of them, a lot of interesting different looks. Keep an eye out for them. I think they could. I don't know. My heart says they could be good with these DPS comps and playing chaotic and just kind of mechanicsing other people, if that makes sense. Just brute forcing, clicking heads. But there again, they don't have some of these amazing mechanical players. They have a lot of just good players. And there's nothing wrong with just having good players. But if you're going to play that style, you want the Carpes, you want the Fletas, you want the EQOs, You want these crazy mechanically sound players that can just win you fights if you're going to play that chaotic style. Hangzhou doesn't have that, in my opinion. Who does have that is Guangzhou. Guangzhou Charge has Shu. They have Happy. Let them play what they're good at. Was it the map pool against Paris? Possibly, culminating in the Eternal playing on the assault map Paris. And Guangzhou trying to beat the Bastion with having more shields and a Bastion of their own. It seemed like a mess. The Eternal running Sombra shuts it down completely. I do think Guangzhou learned a lot this week. Apparently, Kib in an interview at the arena mentioned that, practice was not mimicking what was happening on stage. So there is a little bit of a disjoint there. I don't know what level of success is happening behind the scenes that isn't being replicated on stage, if that makes sense. How successful are they in practice versus what kind of looks we've seen from them thus far. I can't imagine that it's too terribly much more, but maybe we're wrong. Maybe somehow nerves have gotten involved. I have no idea. I think it's been kind of interesting to see them struggle, I would say, leaning into this meta. And I wonder if that is because they have a hard time communicating with one another, because they have they speak Mandarin, Korean, the Koreans speak English, and then you have two English speakers. Like, there's got to be a very interesting communication structure behind the scenes there. Is that kind of a culprit in them struggling to adapt to this meta? Possibility. Could be hindering them a little bit. But in the same way that Hangzhou can play this chaotic style, I think the Charge can play that as well. And they kind of almost feel like they should be, with Rio being so flexible, Happy being so mechanically proficient, and Shu being an absolute beast. I think if you lean into their hero pools more and just play around those three characters, those three absolute carry style players, I think the Charge can turn it around. But maybe not this stage. I think they'll have better looks, but their schedule is very, very rough. And speaking of the Eternal, they're my last team I want to talk about. I was worried that they were cutting quite a bit of people there. But for the most part, solid looks for them overall. I've mentioned on Twitter and I believe Reddit, I think Reddit got a hold of this one, that I was not a big fan of Shadowburn Zafara. I always thought it was pretty hit or miss, and he decided to hit this week and did very, very well. So, commendable efforts there. Gotta respect it, but I need to see more before I just completely change my opinion. I still think, hit or miss. Sometimes you hit, but sometimes you miss. It is inconsistent. If I can see more consistent looks from his Pharah, if Paris leans into that Pharah more often, this is the stage to do it as well. I'll be totally willing to eat crow and give him the looks, the shout there. Kind of respect and really lean into the Pharah pick. LH Cloudy, I think everybody kind of expected him to start over Ben Best if there ever was going to be another Winston-esque meta or something that was a little bit more heavy on Winston. I assumed Cloudy was going to start there. It changes up how Paris was going to play, but if you look statistically, I mentioned this on a podcast the other night, that Paris is a pretty passive team, surprisingly enough. You have these aggressive players. They're playing a passive style in stage 1. Stage 2, I think they're leaning into more of that passivity, being a little bit more methodical with their aggression. I think that's much better for them just stylistically. This feels like a holistic level up for them with Cloudy on the roster. So, kudos to that as well. And soon being able to kind of rotate off the Zarya, which he has looked very, very detrimental on. I think moving him away from that hero was the best bet, and it's nice to see them succeed in a meta where nobody really saw them succeeding. And, this was a team that was supposed to succeed last stage and didn't. Nobody kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt in stage 2 and tried to figure out, you had Shadowburn being, kind of bigged up as like this washed up DPS player coming out and making a statement. Soon, in the same sense, can't plays a very poor Zarya, I would say. Doesn't look very comfortable on it at all. Now he can play the Sombra. He can play DPS heroes, much more in his wheelhouse. Paris looks to be holistically much better for it as well. So that's kind of week 1 in review of stage 2. Stage 2, week 2 begins on the 11th, which is just in a couple days. So hopefully I'll have one of these probably a little bit better prepared. Maybe I won't go through all of the games and just ramble off the scores and how I felt about them, but nonetheless, learning experiences all around. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, any comments you want to leave, my shirt matches my bed sheet, let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks so much.